In the quiet of Windsor Castle, King Charles III sat alone in his private study, his weathered hands trembling as he held a piece of cream-colored paper that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his late ex-wife. The letter, written in Diana's distinctive handwriting just months before her tragic death in Paris, had been discovered tucked away in a forgotten jewelry box that once belonged to the Princess of Wales. As Charles read the words that Diana had poured her heart into, tears began to stream down his face. The letter revealed a secret so profound, so heartbreaking, that it would force the future king to make an impossible choice between the woman he loved and the son he had failed to truly understand. What Diana had written would not only expose the deepest wounds of their fractured marriage, but would ultimately lead Charles to make a decision that would shock the royal family and change the line of succession forever. The discovery came on a rainy Thursday morning in October 2023, exactly 26 years after Diana's death. Prince William had been sorting through his mother's remaining personal effects, items that had been stored in various royal residences for decades. The task was emotionally draining, each photograph and piece of jewelry bringing back memories of the vibrant woman who had shaped his early years before being tragically taken from him when he was just 15. In Diana's former dressing room at Kensington Palace, William found an ornate jewelry box that had somehow been overlooked during previous clearances. The box was locked, its small brass key missing, but William felt compelled to open it. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper and forgotten trinkets, he discovered a collection of letters Diana had written but never sent. Most were drafts of correspondence to various charities and friends, but one envelope stood out. It was addressed simply to Charles in Diana's careful script, and it was sealed. William's hands shook as he held the envelope. He knew he should respect his mother's privacy, but something urged him to break the seal. What he read inside left him stunned, and immediately convinced him that his father needed to see these words. The letter was dated August 15, 1997, just 2 weeks before Diana's fatal car crash in Paris. The contents revealed Diana's deepest regrets about their marriage, but, more importantly, it contained her observations about Charles's relationship with their sons, particularly William. Diana had written about moments she had witnessed between Charles and young William, interactions that Charles himself might have forgotten or dismissed as unimportant. She described how William would wait by the window for hours when Charles promised to visit, how the boy would practice conversations in his room, preparing topics he thought might interest his father. Most devastatingly, Diana had written about overhearing a conversation between 6-year-old William and his nanny, where the young prince had asked if his father didn't love him because he wasn't good at the things Charles enjoyed. Diana wrote about how this moment had broken her heart, and how she had tried to compensate for Charles's emotional distance by being both mother and father to their sons. The letter also contained Diana's fears about what would happen to William and Harry if something were to happen to her. She worried that Charles would become even more distant, focusing entirely on his royal duties and his relationship with Camilla, leaving their sons to navigate their grief alone. Diana had written with remarkable foresight about the psychological impact this could have on both boys, particularly William, who would one day bear the weight of the crown. When William called his father and insisted on an urgent private meeting, Charles initially assumed it was about some aspect of royal business. They met in Charles's private quarters at Clarence House, where William silently handed over the letter. The color drained from Charles's face as he read his late ex-wife's words. The letter forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his relationship with his eldest son and the choices he had made in the years following Diana's death. Charles had always believed he had done his best as a father under difficult circumstances. He had provided for his sons, ensured they received the best education, and gradually introduced them to their royal responsibilities. But Diana's letter painted a different picture. It revealed a pattern of emotional unavailability that Charles had been blind to, moments where his sons had needed him, but he had been absent, physically or emotionally. The letter described specific incidents that Charles now remembered with new clarity. There was the time 8-year-old William had won his first school sporting event and had scanned the crowd desperately looking for his father, only to find that Charles had canceled at the last minute for a royal engagement. Diana wrote about how William had pretended not to care, but she had found him crying in his room later that evening. Another passage detailed how teenage William had attempted to connect with Charles by showing interest in architecture and environmental causes, Charles's passions, but Charles had been so busy with his own projects that he had missed his son's genuine efforts to build a relationship. Diana had observed these attempts and had encouraged William to keep trying, even when it seemed hopeless. As Charles read on, he realized that Diana had seen something he had missed entirely. She had witnessed William's desperate attempts to earn his father's attention and approval, and she had watched as those attempts gradually diminished over the years. By the time William was a teenager, he had largely given up on forming a close relationship with Charles, accepting that they would maintain a formal, dutiful connection based on their royal roles rather than genuine paternal affection. The most painful part of the letter came toward the end, where Diana had written about her own role in the family's dysfunction. She admitted to sometimes using the children as emotional support during her darkest moments, and she acknowledged that her very public struggles had put additional pressure on William and Harry. But she also expressed her deep concern about what would happen to her sons if Charles continued to prioritize his relationship with Camilla over his responsibilities as a father. Diana had written that she understood Charles's love for Camilla, but she feared that this relationship would become an escape from the more difficult work of rebuilding his relationship with their sons. She worried that Charles would find it easier to create a new life with Camilla than to address the damage that had been done to his relationship with William and Harry. The letter concluded with Diana's hope that if something were to happen to her, Charles would recognize that Camilla could never replace what their sons needed from their father. She wrote that while Camilla might make Charles happy, only Charles himself could repair the relationships with William and Harry that had been damaged by years of conflict and emotional distance. Reading these words in 2023, with the perspective of 26 years, Charles was forced to confront how accurately Diana had predicted the future. Despite his efforts to include Camilla in family gatherings and his hope that she would become a positive maternal figure for his sons, the relationships had remained complicated and often strained. William and Harry had been polite to Camilla, but there had never been the genuine warmth and connection that Charles had hoped would develop over time. The impact of Diana's letter on Charles was immediate and profound. For several days after reading it, he found himself unable to focus on his royal duties, his mind constantly returning to the painful truths Diana had forced him to confront. He began to see his relationship with William through an entirely different lens, recognizing patterns of behavior and missed opportunities that he had previously overlooked or rationalized away. Charles started to recall conversations with William over the years where his son had attempted to share personal thoughts or concerns, only to be met with formal responses or redirections toward official business. He remembered times when William had seemed to want to talk about his mother, his grief, or his fears about his future role, but Charles had been uncomfortable with these emotional conversations and had quickly steered them towards safer, more practical topics. The letter also made Charles realize how much he had relied on others to maintain his relationship with his sons. Palace staff, private secretaries, and even Camilla had often served as intermediaries, providing updates about William and Harry's lives and feelings rather than Charles engaging with them directly. He had convinced himself that this was simply how royal families functioned, but Diana's observations made it clear that his sons had needed something more personal and immediate from their father. Haunted by these revelations, Charles decided to take an unprecedented step. He called William and asked if they could spend a weekend together at Balmoral, just the two of them, without any official duties or other family members present. William was surprised by the request, but agreed, though he wondered what had prompted this unusual invitation. The weekend at Balmoral was unlike any time Charles and William had spent together since William was a young child. Charles had dismissed all staff except for essential security and housekeeping, and he had cleared his schedule completely. For the first time in decades, father and son were forced to interact without the buffer of royal protocol or the presence of others who might fill conversational gaps. Initially, both men struggled with the unfamiliar intimacy of the situation. Their conversations were stilted and formal, covering safe topics like estate management and upcoming royal engagements. But as the hours passed, Charles found himself drawing courage from Diana's letter and began to ask William more personal questions about his feelings, his marriage to Catherine, his hopes for his children, and his concerns about his future role as king. William was initially cautious, unsure of his father's motivations, and wary of being vulnerable after years of maintaining emotional distance. But gradually, he began to open up, sharing thoughts and feelings he had never expressed to his father. He talked about the pressure he felt to be the perfect future king, his struggles with anxiety about living up to his mother's legacy, and his fears about subjecting his own children to the scrutiny and expectations that had shaped his own childhood. Most significantly, William spoke about how he had always felt like he was competing with Camilla for his father's attention and affection. He explained that while he respected Charles's right to find happiness after his divorce from Diana, he had often felt that Camilla's needs and feelings were prioritized over those of his sons. William described feeling like a guest in his father's life rather than a central figure, and he revealed how this had affected his own approach to fatherhood with Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. Charles listened to these revelations with growing horror and shame. He began to understand how his attempts to integrate Camilla into the family had inadvertently marginalized his son's emotional needs. He realized that in his eagerness to have his relationship with Camilla accepted and celebrated, he had failed to recognize that William and Harry needed time and space to process their own grief and adjust to the new family dynamic. The conversation continued late into the evening, with Charles sharing his own struggles and regrets. He admitted that he had been emotionally unprepared for fatherhood when William was born, having had little modeling of warm paternal relationships from his own upbringing. He acknowledged that he had often felt more comfortable in his public role than in his private relationships, and he confessed that Diana's death had left him feeling guilty and uncertain about how to parent their sons alone. Charles also revealed something that shocked William. He had always felt intimidated by Diana's natural ability to connect with their sons. He had watched her effortlessly engage with William and Harry, understanding their needs and communicating with them in ways that seemed impossible for him to replicate. After her death, rather than learning from her example, he had retreated further into formality, convinced that he could never measure up to the warmth and intuition she had brought to their parenting. The weekend marked the beginning of a transformation in their relationship, but it also forced Charles to confront a painful reality about his marriage to Camilla. As he and William continued their conversations over the following weeks and months, Charles began to see how his relationship with Camilla had been used as an emotional crutch, allowing him to avoid the difficult work of rebuilding his connections with his sons. This realization was complicated by the fact that Charles genuinely loved Camilla and had found great happiness and stability in their relationship. She had supported him through some of the most difficult periods of his life, including the aftermath of Diana's death, the public criticism of their relationship, and the challenges of his role as king. The idea of jeopardizing their marriage felt devastating, but Charles could no longer ignore the impact their relationship had had on his role as a father. Charles began to notice patterns in his behavior that he had previously overlooked. When William or Harry needed his attention for personal matters, he would often discuss these requests with Camilla first, seeking her advice and perspective before responding to his sons. While this might have seemed like healthy communication between spouses, Charles realized that it had created a barrier between him and his sons, making them feel that their relationship with their father was mediated by a woman who, despite her good intentions, could never fully understand their unique position and needs. He also recognized that many of the family traditions and gatherings he had established since marrying Camilla had been designed primarily around her comfort and preferences rather than creating opportunities for him to connect with William and Harry. Holiday celebrations, family dinners, and even casual gatherings had been structured in ways that made Camilla the central figure, with Charles's sons often feeling like they were participating in someone else's family rather than their own. The more Charles reflected on these dynamics, the more he understood why William had maintained such careful emotional distance over the years. His son had learned to navigate the family relationships with diplomatic skill, always polite to Camilla, always respectful of his father's choices, but never fully invested in creating deeper connections because he had learned that his father's primary emotional allegiance lay elsewhere. This understanding was painful for Charles because it forced him to confront the possibility that his marriage to Camilla, despite bringing him personal happiness, had prevented him from being the father his sons needed. The choice between his role as a husband and his responsibilities as a father had never been presented so starkly, but Diana's letter and his subsequent conversations with William had made it impossible to ignore. The transformation in Charles and William's relationship began to create unexpected complications in other areas of Charles's life. As father and son spent more time together and developed a deeper understanding of each other, Charles found himself naturally making choices that prioritized William's needs and perspectives over Camilla's preferences. These changes, while positive for his relationship with his eldest son, began to create tension in his marriage. Camilla had always understood that Charles's children would be an important part of their life together, but she had grown accustomed to being his primary confidant and advisor on all matters, including those involving William and Harry. Now, as Charles began consulting William directly on family decisions and spending more individual time with him, Camilla found herself feeling increasingly excluded from conversations and decisions that had previously included her perspective. The shift was subtle at first. Charles began scheduling regular private dinners with William, something he had never done consistently in the past. These meals, initially focused on discussing William's preparation for his future role as king, gradually evolved into more personal conversations about family, relationships, and the emotional challenges of royal life. Charles discovered that William had inherited not only Diana's compassion and intuition, but also her ability to offer insightful advice about human relationships and public service. As these conversations deepened, Charles found himself turning to William for guidance on matters that he had previously discussed exclusively with Camilla. When faced with difficult decisions about royal charities, public appearances, or family matters, Charles began seeking William's opinion first, valuing his son's perspective as someone who would eventually inherit the responsibility for these decisions. This change in dynamic was particularly evident during family gatherings and public events. Previously, Charles had always ensured that Camilla was positioned as his primary companion and advisor, consulting with her privately before making public statements or family announcements. Now, he began to naturally gravitate toward William during these occasions, seeking his input and including him in conversations that had previously been limited to Charles and Camilla. The most significant shift occurred during the planning for Christmas celebrations at Sandringham. Traditionally, Charles and Camilla had organized these gatherings together, with Camilla taking the lead on many domestic arrangements and social aspects of the celebration. But when William suggested that they incorporate some of the traditions that he remembered from his childhood with Diana, Charles immediately embraced these ideas without consulting Camilla first. William's suggestions were thoughtful and aimed at creating more meaningful connections between family members. He proposed organizing activities that would engage his children with their grandfather in ways that went beyond formal interactions. He suggested cooking projects, nature walks, and storytelling sessions that would allow Charles to share his passions for environmental conservation and history with the next generation. While these ideas were wonderful in themselves, the way Charles implemented them created problems. He became so enthusiastic about building these new traditions with William and his family that he inadvertently sidelined Camilla's role in organizing and hosting family gatherings. Camilla, who had worked for years to establish herself as a welcoming and inclusive stepmother figure, found herself watching from the sidelines as Charles and William created new family dynamics that seemed to exclude her input and participation. The tension came to a head during a private conversation between Charles and Camilla in early 2024. Camilla, who had always been diplomatic about sharing Charles's attention with his children, finally expressed her feelings of displacement and confusion about the changes in their relationship. She pointed out that while she supported Charles's efforts to improve his relationship with William, she felt that this improvement was coming at the expense of their marriage and her role in the family. Camilla's concerns were not unreasonable. She had spent nearly 2 decades carefully building relationships with Charles's sons, always being mindful of their grief over their mother and respectful of Diana's continuing influence in their lives. She had never tried to replace Diana, but had worked to create a different kind of supportive relationship with William and Harry. Now, she felt that her efforts were being dismissed as Charles seemed to rediscover the importance of his paternal relationships. Charles was caught between competing loyalties and emotions. On one hand, his relationship with William was finally developing the depth and authenticity that he had always hoped for but had never known how to achieve. For the first time, he felt like he was truly being a father rather than just fulfilling a role, and the connection he was building with William was giving him insights into his other relationships and responsibilities as king. On the other hand, Charles deeply loved Camilla and felt grateful for the stability and happiness she had brought to his life during some of his most difficult years. The thought of hurting her or damaging their marriage was painful, especially because he recognized that his previous emotional unavailability as a father was not her fault. Camilla had always encouraged him to spend time with his sons and had never explicitly prevented him from building stronger relationships with them. The situation became more complicated when William began to express opinions about royal decisions that differed from Camilla's perspectives. As Charles sought William's input on various matters, he discovered that his son often had different priorities and approaches than Camilla did. William's focus on modernizing the monarchy and making it more relatable to younger generations sometimes conflicted with Camilla's more traditional approaches to royal duties and public appearances. These differences in perspective forced Charles to choose between supporting his wife's established methods and embracing his son's innovative ideas. Increasingly, he found himself siding with William, partly because he recognized that William's vision would shape the future of the monarchy, but also because he was discovering that his son's insights were often more astute and forward-thinking than he had previously realized. The most significant conflict arose over the role that Camilla would play in future coronations and state ceremonies. William had privately expressed to Charles his belief that while Camilla deserved respect and recognition as Charles's wife, the emphasis on her role in major royal events sometimes overshadowed the historical significance of these occasions and confused the public about the line of succession. William's perspective was that royal ceremonies should focus primarily on the continuity of the monarchy and the preparation of future generations to serve the British people. While Camilla's presence and participation were appropriate, William felt that too much emphasis on her role detracted from the deeper purpose of these events and sometimes made them seem more like personal celebrations than national occasions. This viewpoint put Charles in an impossible position. He understood William's reasoning and could see the merit in his arguments about the institutional aspects of royal ceremonies. At the same time, diminishing Camilla's role in these events would be a betrayal of his wife and would undo years of work to establish her legitimate place in the royal family. The tension between these competing priorities came to symbolize the larger dilemma that Charles was facing. Diana's letter had opened his eyes to the emotional distance he had maintained with his sons, and his subsequent relationship building with William had been deeply rewarding. But repairing his relationship with William seemed to require choices that inevitably affected his relationship with Camilla. As Charles wrestled with these competing loyalties, he began to realize that the decision he was facing was not just about family dynamics, but about the future direction of the monarchy itself. The choice between prioritizing his relationship with Camilla or his relationship with William was also a choice about whether the royal family would focus on personal happiness or institutional responsibility, on present comfort or future legacy. The breaking point in Charles's internal struggle came during a private conversation with Prince Harry in the spring of 2024. Harry had been observing the changes in his father's relationship with William from a distance, and during one of his increasingly rare visits to the UK, he asked Charles directly about the transformation he had witnessed. Harry's perspective was unique because he had maintained more emotional distance from both Charles and Camilla over the years, which allowed him to observe family dynamics with some objectivity. He told Charles that while he was pleased to see him finally developing a genuine relationship with William, he was concerned about the impact this was having on Camilla, whom Harry had grown to respect despite their complicated history. But Harry also shared something that shocked Charles. He revealed that he and William had discussed their father's situation extensively, and they had both concluded that Charles's relationship with Camilla had indeed prevented him from being the father they had needed after Diana's death. Harry explained that both brothers had recognized this pattern for years, but had never felt they could address it directly without seeming to undermine Charles's personal happiness. Harry's observations forced Charles to confront the reality that his sons had been protecting him from difficult truths about his own parenting, just as he had been avoiding these truths himself. The brothers had recognized that their father's emotional investment in his relationship with Camilla had left little room for the kind of intimate, personal connections they had needed from him, especially during their adolescent years when they were processing their grief over Diana's death and adapting to their royal responsibilities. This revelation was devastating for Charles because it made him realize that his sons had essentially sacrificed their own emotional needs to protect his relationship with Camilla. They had maintained polite, cordial relationships with their stepmother while privately acknowledging that their father's marriage had come at the cost of deeper paternal relationships. Harry also shared details about conversations he had had with William over the years, particularly during times when William had been struggling with the pressures of his role or seeking guidance about his relationship with Catherine. William had often expressed frustration that he could not turn to Charles for the kind of personal, emotional support that he needed, because Charles seemed too invested in maintaining harmony with Camilla to engage in potentially difficult conversations with his sons. The most painful revelation came when Harry told Charles about a conversation he had witnessed between William and Catherine shortly after their engagement. Catherine had asked William about seeking his father's advice on adapting to royal life and dealing with public scrutiny, but William had explained that Charles was not someone he could confide in about personal struggles because their relationship had always been filtered through Camilla's presence and perspective. William had told Catherine that he had learned to handle royal responsibilities and personal challenges independently because he had never felt that his father was fully available to him as a confidant and advisor. This had made William particularly determined to be emotionally present for his own children in ways that Charles had never been for him. These conversations with Harry forced Charles to recognize that the impact of his relationship with Camilla extended far beyond his immediate family dynamics. William's approach to his own marriage and parenting had been shaped by his desire to avoid repeating the patterns he had experienced with Charles. William's determination to prioritize his relationship with Catherine and his children over other royal obligations was partly a response to watching his father prioritize his relationship with Camilla over his connections with his sons. As Charles reflected on these patterns, he began to understand that Diana's letter had been prophetic in ways that extended beyond her immediate concerns about her son's emotional welfare. Diana had worried that Charles would find it easier to build a new life with Camilla than to do the difficult work of repairing his relationships with William and Harry, and this prediction had proven accurate. More significantly, Charles realized that his pattern of emotional avoidance had not only affected his sons but had also limited his effectiveness as a father and as king. By relying on Camilla as his primary emotional support and advisor, he had missed opportunities to learn from his sons' perspectives and to develop the kind of relationships with them that would strengthen the monarchy's future. The weight of these revelations led Charles to make a decision that surprised even himself. He arranged a private meeting with Camilla in which he expressed his love and gratitude for everything she had brought to his life, but also shared his growing understanding of how their relationship had inadvertently prevented him from being the father his sons had needed. Charles explained to Camilla that Diana's letter had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his parenting, and that his subsequent conversations with William and Harry had revealed the extent to which his emotional investment in their marriage had come at the cost of deeper relationships with his children. He acknowledged that this was not Camilla's fault, but he also recognized that continuing to prioritize their relationship over his role as a father would have lasting consequences for the monarchy and for his sons' futures. The conversation was heartbreaking for both Charles and Camilla. She had always known that her relationship with Charles's sons was complicated, but she had believed that time and patience would eventually allow them to develop genuine family bonds. The idea that her presence in Charles's life had actually prevented these relationships from developing was painful and confusing. Camilla also felt that she was being unfairly blamed for Charles's own emotional limitations. She had never asked him to choose between his relationship with her and his relationships with his sons, and she had consistently encouraged him to spend time with William and Harry. From her perspective, Charles's difficulties in connecting with his children stemmed from his own upbringing and personality rather than from any interference on her part. However, as Charles shared specific examples of how his need to consider her feelings and perspectives had influenced his interactions with his sons, Camilla began to understand the subtle ways in which their relationship had indeed created barriers. She recognized that Charles had often avoided difficult conversations with William and Harry because he was concerned about how these conversations might affect her, or because he was seeking her input before responding to his son's needs. The most difficult part of the conversation came when Charles revealed that he was considering making significant changes to their relationship and to Camilla's role in royal ceremonies and family gatherings. He explained that while he would always love her and value their relationship, he had come to believe that his responsibilities as a father and as king required him to prioritize his relationships with his sons in ways that might limit Camilla's prominence in royal life. Charles proposed that they gradually transition to a relationship where Camilla maintained her title and position but stepped back from certain high-profile royal duties and family functions. This would allow Charles to focus more intensively on building stronger relationships with William and Harry while also demonstrating to the public and the royal family that the institution's future depended on the strength of relationships between generations rather than on the personal happiness of individual monarchs. The proposal was devastating for Camilla, who had spent years working to establish her legitimate place in the royal family and had looked forward to playing a significant role as queen consort. The idea of voluntarily stepping back from duties and ceremonies felt like a betrayal of everything they had worked to achieve together. But as the conversation continued, both Charles and Camilla began to recognize that the choice they were facing was ultimately about what kind of legacy they wanted to leave. Charles could continue to prioritize his personal happiness and his relationship with Camilla, but doing so would likely perpetuate the emotional distance that had characterized his relationships with his sons and would limit his effectiveness as both a father and a king. Alternatively, Charles could choose to prioritize his paternal responsibilities and his institutional duties, even if this meant making personal sacrifices that would be painful for both him and Camilla. This choice would be difficult and lonely, but it might allow him to repair the damage that had been done to his relationships with his sons and to provide them with the emotional support they would need as they prepared for their own roles in the monarchy. The decision Charles ultimately made would reshape not only his personal relationships, but the entire future of the British monarchy. After weeks of agonizing reflection and several more conversations with both William and Camilla, Charles chose to prioritize his role as a father over his personal happiness as a husband. This choice, inspired by Diana's heartbreaking letter and his newfound understanding of his failures as a parent, marked one of the most significant personal sacrifices made by a British monarch in modern history. The transition began gradually, with Charles and Camilla jointly announcing that the queen consort would be reducing her public duties to focus on her personal interests and charitable work. This announcement was carefully crafted to avoid any suggestion of marital problems, instead framing the change as a natural evolution that would allow Charles to concentrate more intensively on preparing William for his future role as king. Privately, Charles and Camilla agreed to maintain their marriage, but to restructure their relationship in ways that would give Charles more freedom to focus on his sons and their families. Camilla would continue to live at Clarence House and would participate in major royal events, but she would no longer serve as Charles's primary advisor on family matters or royal decisions. Instead, Charles would work more directly with William on these issues, gradually transferring more responsibility to his eldest son. The change was perhaps most evident in Charles's daily routine and priorities, where he had once spent his evenings discussing the day's events with Camilla and seeking her perspective on upcoming decisions. Charles began spending this time in conversation with William, either in person or via video calls when they were in different locations. These conversations allowed father and son to discuss not only official royal business, but also personal concerns, family dynamics, and their shared vision for the monarchy's future. William was initially cautious about his father's transformation, having been disappointed by Charles's promises of change in the past. But as weeks turned into months, William began to see that this change was different. Charles was not just spending more time with him. He was actively seeking William's emotional and intellectual input in ways that had never happened before. For the first time, William felt that his father was truly interested in understanding his perspectives and experiences rather than simply fulfilling paternal obligations. The impact of this change extended beyond William to include Catherine and their children. Charles began developing genuine, personal relationships with his grandchildren, participating in activities that were meaningful to them rather than simply appearing at formal family occasions. He started reading bedtime stories to Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis during his visits, engaging with them in ways that reflected their interests and personalities rather than treating these interactions as photo opportunities. Catherine, who had always maintained a respectful but somewhat distant relationship with Charles, found herself becoming one of his closest confidants. As Charles worked to understand modern parenting and to support William in ways he had never experienced from his own father, he turned to Catherine for insights about family dynamics, child development, and the challenges of raising children in the public eye. The transformation was equally significant in Charles's relationship with Prince Harry. Although Harry remained physically distant from the royal family due to his relocation to the United States, Charles began making unprecedented efforts to maintain regular, meaningful contact with his younger son. These conversations were often difficult, as they required Charles to acknowledge and apologize for years of emotional distance and missed opportunities. Harry, who had always been more openly critical of his father's parenting than William, was initially skeptical of Charles's change in approach. But, as Charles demonstrated consistent effort to understand Harry's perspective and to support his decisions, even when they conflicted with royal traditions, Harry began to cautiously rebuild his relationship with his father. The change in family dynamics had profound implications for the monarchy's public image and institutional strength. As Charles and William began working more closely together, their joint appearances and collaborative decision-making demonstrated a continuity and stability that strengthened public confidence in the royal family's future. The visible warmth and mutual respect between father and son contrasted sharply with the formal, distant relationships that had previously characterized royal family interactions. Perhaps most importantly, Charles's decision to prioritize his relationship with William allowed them to collaborate on modernizing the monarchy in ways that neither could have achieved independently. William's innovative ideas about making the royal family more accessible and relevant to younger generations were now supported by Charles's experience and institutional knowledge. Together, they began implementing changes that preserved the monarchy's traditions while adapting to contemporary expectations and values. The personal cost of these changes for Charles was significant. His relationship with Camilla, while maintained, was necessarily diminished, and he often felt lonely and isolated as he worked to repair decades of emotional distance from his sons. There were moments when Charles questioned whether the sacrifice was worthwhile, particularly during family gatherings where Camilla's reduced role created awkward dynamics. But Charles found strength in remembering Diana's letter and in observing the positive changes in his relationships with his children and grandchildren. For the first time since Diana's death, Charles felt that he was truly fulfilling his role as a father rather than simply going through the motions. The conversations he was having with William and Harry were deeper and more meaningful than any they had shared since the boys were very young. The transformation also had unexpected benefits for Charles's role as king. By working more closely with William and by understanding his son's perspectives on contemporary issues, Charles became more effective in his public duties and more relevant to younger generations of British citizens. His speeches and public appearances began reflecting insights and concerns that resonated with families throughout the country, particularly those dealing with divorce, grief, and complex family relationships. The story of Charles's choice became a powerful example of how personal growth and institutional responsibility could align in ways that strengthened both family relationships and public service. Diana's letter, discovered more than a quarter-century after her death, had finally achieved what her living presence had never been able to accomplish. It had forced Charles to confront his limitations as a father and to make the difficult changes necessary to repair his relationships with his sons. As Charles reflected on the journey that had led him to this point, he often returned to Diana's words about the importance of putting their children's needs above personal happiness. Her letter had been a final gift to their family, providing the insight and motivation necessary for Charles to become the father that William and Harry had always needed him to be. The future of the British monarchy now rested on stronger foundations than had existed since Diana's death. Charles and William's collaborative relationship promised continuity and modernization, while the genuine warmth and respect between family members provided a model for how the royal family could serve both institutional and personal needs. Diana's heartbreaking letter had ultimately become the catalyst for healing that she had hoped for but had never lived to see.